You have gathered here not merely to hear words, but to enter into an atmosphere of depth where the ordinary dissolves and the hidden truths of the psyche come alive. I speak to you as one who has spent a lifetime listening to the whispers of the unconscious, to the cries that emerge from the dreams of humanity, and to the silent tremors of the soul that reveal themselves when the mask of the persona is stripped away. Tonight, let us enter into a subject that burns quietly in the lives of many. The strange alchemy by which silence itself, usually regarded as absence, becomes a profound weapon in the hands of the empath when faced with the consuming hunger of the narcissist. Understand, my friends, the encounter between the empath and the narcissist is not simply a relationship between two individuals. It is an archetypal drama enacted again and again in the great theater of the collective unconscious. It is the story of the light bearer who seeks connection, whose soul is finally attuned to the suffering of others, and the shadow feeder who constructs a false image of grandeur, consuming endlessly, yet never satiated. This is not mere pathology. It is myth enacted in flesh. The empath represents the archetype of the wounded healer, whose very sensitivity becomes both blessing and curse. The narcissist represents the archetype of the devouring shadow, the false king who demands worship for a mask that hides emptiness. The empath enters such relationships not by accident but by the magnetic law of the unconscious. For what we do not recognize within ourselves, we are fated to meet outside. If you are an empath, your sensitivity often arises from wounds in your own childhood, where you learned to attune yourself to the moods, the storms, the silences of those upon whom your survival depended. You became an antenna for the unconscious of others, believing that if you could soothe, heal, or appease, you might earn love, or at least avoid destruction. Thus, when you meet the narcissist, their hunger is familiar to you. It resonates with an old pattern deep within your psyche, and without knowing it, you step again into the labyrinth of your own unfinished story. The narcissist, by contrast, lives in perpetual flight from the abyss within. Their grandiosity is a fortress built over an ocean of shame. Their voice is loud because silence terrifies them. It would reveal the hollowness behind the mask. They seek mirrors, not partners. They demand adoration, not intimacy. And the empath, with a heart open to the cries of others, becomes the perfect mirror, reflecting back the false king's imagined radiance. But here lies the tragedy. In giving endlessly, the empath begins to lose themselves, feeding a hunger that can never be satisfied. It is like pouring water into a vessel riddled with holes, and yet, paradoxically, it is in silence that the empath begins to discover their hidden power. You see, silence is not merely the absence of speech. In the psychology of the depths, silence is a container, a vessel that holds energy. It is a refusal to participate in the endless game of projection and counter-projection. When the empath withdraws into silence, they are no longer the mirror. They cease to feed the narcissist's fragile illusion. They become like a dark moon present, but refusing to reflect light. To the narcissist, this silence is unbearable. It exposes the void they have tried so desperately to conceal. And yet for the empath, this same silence becomes sanctuary, a space in which the soul can breathe again, where the self can remember itself apart from the devouring gaze of the other. But let us not misunderstand this silence. It is not the silence of cowardice, nor of passive submission. It is a silence born of awareness, the silence of one who has descended into the unconscious and returned with knowledge. In myth, this is akin to Persephone's descent into Hades. The empath who chooses silence is like Persephone holding the pomegranate seed, no longer naive, no longer merely the victim, but one who knows the kingdom of shadows and yet retains their own sovereignty. This silence is charged with meaning because it is a refusal to be complicit in the archetypal drama of feeding the false king. It is the empath saying, without words, I will not give you my light so that you may avoid your own darkness. Consider, too, the symbolic meaning of silence in dreams, when voices are muted, when the dreamer tries to scream and no sound emerges. It often represents the confrontation with the shadow where language itself is insufficient. Silence here is not weakness, it is the psyche acknowledging that certain truths cannot be spoken, only endured, integrated. When the empath wields silence consciously, it is as if they are embodying this dream symbol, refusing to perpetuate illusions and instead confronting the raw fact of being the narcissist who thrives on words, praise, arguments, accusations. All forms of attention finds themselves disarmed. For how does one manipulate silence? How does one twist what is not spoken? It cannot be done. Silence slips through their grasp like smoke, leaving them exposed. Yet silence is not easy for the empath. To fall silent in the face of the narcissist storm requires immense courage. For the empath's deepest wound is the fear of abandonment, of invisibility, of being unloved. Their impulse is to explain, to justify, to reach out again and again in hope that the other will finally see them, hear them, love them. But this reaching is precisely what keeps them bound. The silence I speak of is a breaking of that cycle, a stepping out of the archetypal script. It is the moment the dreamer realizes, I am not merely a character in this nightmare. I am also the dreamer, and I can choose another ending. We must understand this also in terms of individuation. The journey of individuation is not about rejecting others, but about integrating the opposites within oneself, about becoming whole. For the empath, the shadow often contains repressed anger, boundaries, and the right to exist apart from others' demands. In learning to wield silence, the empath begins to integrate this shadow. They are no longer merely the giver, the healer, the sacrificer. They allow within themselves the archetype of the warrior, the one who guards the boundaries of the soul. Silence, in this sense, is the sword they did not know. They possessed, it cuts without visible motion. It protects without spilling blood. It is the word unspoken that reshapes the relationship. And so, when silence becomes the empath's weapon, it does more than disarm the narcissist. It transforms the empaths themselves in silence. They discover that their worth does not depend on being needed, that their existence does not require constant validation from the other. In silence, they return to the wellspring of their own soul. They may feel fear, for silence brings them face to face with their own loneliness, their own unhealed wounds. But if they can endure that silence, they will find it is not emptiness, but fullness. Not absence, but presence. They will hear the voice of the self, the deep center of the psyche that whispers, "You are." And that, my friends, is the beginning of freedom. Think of the mystics who retreated into silence. Think of the desert fathers, of the monks who took vows not to speak. They were not escaping the world. They were confronting it at its root within themselves. For the world outside is always a mirror of the world within. The empath who chooses silence before the narcissist is enacting this same mystery. They are stepping out of the illusion of the other's power and into the reality of their own. This silence is not void. It is sacred ground. I tell you, therefore, that this silence is not merely psychological strategy. It is archetypal initiation. The empath becomes like the hermit of the tarot, withdrawing into the mountains with only a lantern of inner light. They become like the high priestess, seated between the pillars of mystery, guarding the knowledge of the unconscious. Their silence is their initiation, right? Their transformation from victim into sovereign. And the narcissist, though they rage, though they hurl accusations, though they try to provoke, cannot touch what is no longer offered. They cannot feed on silence. They cannot devour what is not given. Thus, when silence becomes the empath's weapon, it is not a weapon of destruction, but of liberation. It destroys nothing except illusion. It liberates the empath from the endless cycle of projection and counter-projection. It forces the narcissist to confront, perhaps for the first time, the abyss within themselves, and it marks the moment when the empath steps out of the archetypal drama and begins the true work of individuation. For in the end, the battle was never between empath and narcissist. It was always within the soul of the empath themselves. The silence is not for the other. It is for you. The silence I speak of is not an empty pause, but a threshold. It is the place where the drama of words collapses, where the play of accusations, justifications, and promises dissolves into stillness. And here the soul discovers itself not as an echo, but as a presence. Many who live as empaths have never known such silence, for their lives have been filled with the noise of others' needs, demands, and projections. They have been trained to fill every gap with care, every pause with reassurance. But when you learn to remain in silence, to resist the compulsion to explain or to soothe, you encounter the raw essence of your being. It is like standing before a mirror that no longer reflects an image, but reveals instead a depth, a bottomless well in which the true self resides. The narcissist fears this silence because it unveils the illusion upon which their entire persona rests. To them, silence is rejection, invisibility, annihilation. It is a refusal to participate in their endless play of control. For what is narcissism but a desperate attempt to manipulate reality in order to avoid the unbearable weight of inner emptiness? The narcissist builds castles of words, grandiose declarations, subtle manipulation, promises designed to ensnare, and the empath, sensitive to suffering, often becomes the foundation upon which these castles rest. But when silence descends, the castles crumble, and the narcissist is confronted with the barren field of their own solitude. They rage, not because of you, but because silence reveals them to themselves. In this sense, silence becomes a mirror of a different kind. Unlike the mirror of adoration, which reflects back the narcissist's inflated image, silence mirrors nothing. It is the mirror of truth. It forces the narcissist to see not their illusion of grandeur, but the void they have fled from their entire life. To the empath, this may appear cruel, but it is not cruelty. It is necessity. Without confrontation with the void, no transformation is possible. Without death, no rebirth, and thus the empath who wields silence becomes unwittingly an agent of alchemy. They create the conditions in which the false image must die, though whether the narcissist allows the deeper self to emerge is a question only the soul of that individual can answer. But silence is not for the narcissist's transformation, it is for the empath's liberation. In silence, the empath reclaims their inner ground. They discover that they are not responsible for saving another from their own shadow. They realize that their endless giving was not pure selflessness, but often a disguised plea. See me, love me, do not abandon me. To remain in silence is to sit in the fire of that fear and endure it. It is to confront the archetype of the abandoned child within, the little one who learned to earn love through service, through hyper-attunement, through sacrifice. In silence, this child is seen at last, not by the narcissist, but by you. You become both parent and healer to yourself, holding the abandoned child in the arms of your own awareness. And this is the beginning of individuation, the discovery that the self within is the true source of love. Dreams often reveal this mystery. Many empaths dream of being chased, of being silenced, of screaming with no sound. Such dreams reflect the dynamic of being consumed by others' needs while their own voice is extinguished. Yet, when they begin to embrace silence in waking life, dreams shift. They may find themselves standing in empty rooms, hearing no voices, feeling fear at first, but then recognizing the stillness as peace. Or they may dream of oceans, vast and wordless, where the only sound is the movement of waves. These are archetypal symbols of silence as wholeness, silence as the womb of being. The psyche knows that in silence lies not annihilation, but origin. Let us also remember the archetype of the trickster, for the narcissist is, in many ways, a trickster figure, shifting, deceiving, feeding upon illusions. The trickster thrives on chaos, on provoking reactions, on manipulating narratives. To respond with silence is to step out of the trickster's game. It is like refusing to move the pieces on a chessboard where every move is designed to trap you. Silence lifts you from the board entirely. It is the refusal to play. The trickster loses power not through battle, but through the absence of participation. And in that absence, the empath discovers freedom, yet silence is not a permanent withdrawal from life. It is not an escape from relationship. It is a practice, a threshold, a medicine. The goal is not to abandon speech forever, but to learn when silence carries more truth than words. For there will come a time when the empath must speak again, but speak not from compulsion, not from fear, not from the wound, but from the self. Silence teaches the empath to discern the voice that arises from the center, the voice that is not an echo of others, but a proclamation of their own being. When that voice emerges, it is no longer entangled in the narcissist's web. It is free, so verein, creative. But until that voice is discovered, silence remains the crucible in which the soul is purified. Consider also the spiritual symbolism of silence. The mystics of every tradition have known that God speaks most clearly in silence. The prophets heard the still small voice, not the thunder. The Buddha sat in silence under the Bodhi tree until enlightenment arose. Christ retreated into the wilderness, into solitude, to meet the Father. Silence, therefore, is not emptiness but communion. It is where the divine and the human meet. For the empath who has been so attuned to the cries of others, silence is the place where they finally attune to the voice of the divine within. It is the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary, where the true self dwells. And here lies the paradox. What the narcissist perceives as rejection, the empath experiences as revelation. The same silence that terrifies the one liberates the other. The narcissist hears silence as emptiness, a void they cannot bear. The empath, once they endure the initial fear, discovers silence as fullness, as presence, as wholeness. This is the archetypal reversal, the alchemical transformation, where lead becomes gold. For what was once a wound, the inability to speak, the fear of being unseen becomes a weapon, a source of power, a doorway into the depths of being. The journey is not without suffering. The empaths will feel the pull of old patterns. They will feel guilt, as though their silence is cruelty. They will feel temptation to break it, to soothe, to explain, to return to the familiar role of caretaker. But every time they hold silence, they strengthen the new pattern, they carve a new path in the psyche, a path of sovereignty, and over time, silence ceases to be a weapon and becomes simply a way of being. They no longer need to prove, to justify, to explain. They rest in the quiet knowledge of their own worth. And this, in the language of Jung, is individuation. The realization of the self, the integration of shadow, the emergence of wholeness. You may ask, does silence not risk loneliness? Indeed, it does, but loneliness is the gate through which one must pass to encounter solitude. Loneliness is the shadow of silence, solitude is its light. When you pass through loneliness without fleeing, you arrive at solitude, and in solitude you meet not emptiness but the presence of your own soul. And from that presence, true relationships can be born, relationships not based on need or illusion, but on mutual recognition of the self in the other. So when I tell you that silence is the empath's weapon, understand that it is not a weapon of attack, but of transformation. It is the sword of the spirit, cutting through illusion. It is the shield of the self, guarding against intrusion. It is the womb of the soul, giving birth to wholeness, and it is the mirror of truth, forcing the narcissist to confront themselves. In this silence, the empath becomes more than healer, more than mirror, more than victim. They become sovereign, a bearer of their own light, no longer devoured by the shadows of others. And thus, in this mystery of silence, we glimpse the deeper truth that every encounter with a narcissist, every battle of words, every wound of abandonment is, in the end, a summons to individuation. The narcissist is a catalyst, an unwelcome but powerful messenger, forcing the empath to discover the silence within. They are, in their destructive way, the midwives of transformation. And when the empath answers not with words, but with silence, they step into the archetypal current of the self. They become, at last, a whole. When silence becomes the vessel of transformation, it awakens archetypes that had long been dormant in the empath's psyche. For every silence is inhabited, not empty. It carries within it the voices of ancient symbols, the whispers of the collective unconscious. To understand the empath's awakening, we must listen to these archetypes, for they are the language of the soul. They appear in dreams, in myths, in visions that rise unbidden. When the conscious mind surrenders to stillness, let us walk into these symbolic figures and see how silence manifests itself through them. The first archetype is the hermit. The hermit is not isolation for its own sake, but a figure who carries the lantern of inner light. In silence, the empath becomes the hermit, stepping off the crowded roads where voices clash and illusions demand attention, into the solitude of the mountains. Here, no one calls their name, no one pulls at their energy, no one reflects back a distorted self-image. There is only the vastness of the night sky and the lantern of inner awareness, the hermit knows that the lantern does not burn with borrowed light, but with the flame of the self, the eternal center. The empath who enters silence becomes the hermit, no longer dependent on the gaze of others to know they exist. They walk into solitude and discover that their being is not diminished by the absence of attention, but amplified by it. This is the mystery. That solitude reveals abundance, where dependency saw only lack. The second archetype is the warrior, silence, when wielded consciously, is not passive. It is an act of immense courage. The empath who refuses to engage in the narcissist's manipulations, who resists the temptation to explain or justify, is standing in the strength of the warrior. The warrior does not always swing the sword. Often the greatest battle is won by refusing to step into the battlefield designed by the enemy. Silence is the warrior's stance, a refusal to be drawn into combat, where every word is twisted into a weapon. This silence is not avoidance, but discipline, a recognition that true power does not need to shout. For the empath, this is a radical transformation. They have long associated strength with service, courage with sacrifice, love with surrender, but in silence they discover another strength, the strength to say nothing, to hold their ground, to endure the storm without breaking. Silence becomes their shield, and behind it, the soul gathers strength. The third archetype is the child. The empath silence always brings them face to face with their own wounded child. For the reason silence is so difficult for them is because it awakens the fear of abandonment rooted in childhood. This archetype appears in dreams as a small, frightened figure, often crying, often lost, often ignored. When the empath falls silent before the narcissist, the child within trembles, believing it will be left alone, unloved, unseen. But it is precisely in holding silence that the empath begins to reparent this child. They learn to sit with its fear, to offer presence without words, to say in the stillness, I am here, I will not abandon you. And slowly the child learns that silence does not mean abandonment, but safety, not rejection, but presence. The empath integrates the wounded child, and in doing so, heals the very wound that made them vulnerable to the narcissist's illusions. Silence thus becomes the cradle in which the child is reborn. The fourth archetype is the shadow. Silence is the language of the shadow, for the shadow rarely speaks in clear words. It manifests as absence, as repression, as what is left unsaid. For the empath, the shadow often contains rage, boundaries, the right to say no, the primal instinct to protect the self. These are the qualities the empath has repressed in order to maintain relationships, in order to be loved. When they enter silence, the shadow emerges. At first, it may appear terrifying, unspoken anger, bitterness, desires for revenge. The empath may feel overwhelmed by these forces, tempted to break their silence and discharge them in words. But if they can remain still, if they can let the shadow speak in its own dark silence, they will discover that beneath the rage is energy, vitality, power, integrating this shadow. They reclaim their right to exist as a full human being, not merely as the caretaker of others. Silence becomes the doorway through which the shadow enters consciousness, no longer as an enemy, but as an ally. Now imagine these archetypes together. The hermit carrying the lantern, the warrior standing firm, the child embraced, the shadow integrated. This is the inner counsel of the empath, awakened through silence. Each archetype contributes its wisdom. The hermit shows that solitude is not emptiness, but illumination. The warrior teaches that silence can be strength. The child reveals that silence can heal abandonment. The shadow offers the raw energy needed for wholeness. Together, they transform silence from a wound into a weapon, from a curse into a sacrament. In the collective unconscious, silence is also symbolized by night. Night is a time when voices recede, when the world grows still, when the stars emerge. For many, night is a symbol of fear, of loneliness, of death. But in Jungian psychology, night also symbolizes the unconscious, the womb of renewal. The empath who enters silence, enters night. They must endure the fear of darkness, the loneliness of unlit paths, but in that night they also discover the stars, the archetypal lights that guide them toward wholeness. The narcissist fears night, for in it their mask dissolves. The empath, if they endure, discovers that night is not annihilation but transformation. This archetypal silence is also reflected in alchemy. The alchemists spoke of the nigredo, the blackening, the stage where matter is dissolved into chaos before it can be purified. Silence is the empath's nigredo. It feels like death, like loss, like nothingness. But out of this blackness arises the albedo, the whitening, the illumination of the soul. Out of silence comes clarity. Out of emptiness comes presence. Out of death comes rebirth. Thus, silence is not the end, but the beginning of a deeper process. It is the crucible in which the empath is transformed into their true self. To remain in silence, however, requires a shift in consciousness. One must learn to see silence not as lack, but as fullness, not as passivity, but as action, not as rejection, but as presence. This is a spiritual discipline. It is the practice of meditation, of stillness, of sitting with what is in our modern world, where noise is constant and attention is currency. Silence is revolutionary. It is the refusal to be consumed by the endless demands of voices outside. For the empath, who has always been tuned to others, this refusal is both terrifying and liberating. It is the discovery that they are not defined by the gaze of the other, but by the presence of the self. And here lies the paradox. silence, which seems like withdrawal, is actually a deeper form of engagement, for in silence, the empath no longer engages with the surface drama, but with the depth. They engage not with the narcissist's mask, but with their own soul. They engage with archetypes, with dreams, with the unconscious. They engage with God. Silence is the deepest form of dialogue. A dialogue with the ground of being itself, and from that dialogue emerges a voice no longer entangled in illusion, but resonant with truth. So when the empath chooses silence, they are not abandoning communication. They are shifting its level. They are moving from the horizontal plane of endless argument to the vertical axis of depth. Their silence is not empty. It is filled with presence. It speaks without words. It says, I will not play the game of illusions. I will not feed the false king. I will not abandon myself. I will listen to the self within, and this silence, though invisible, transforms everything. The narcissist finds themselves powerless, the empath finds themselves whole, and the archetypes awaken to guide the journey. This, then, is the true meaning of silence as weapon. It is not the weapon of violence, but of truth. It does not wound the body, but dismantles illusions. It does not destroy the other, but reveals them to themselves. And most importantly, it does not abandon the self, but restores it. The empath who embraces silence steps out of the archetypal pattern of victim and savior and enters the path of individuation. They cease to be defined by the narcissist's hunger and begin to be defined by the voice of the self. In silence, they awaken to their destiny, not to serve illusions, but to embody truth. You must understand, dear soul, that silence is not merely a psychological tactic, but a rite of passage. It is the threshold through which every true seeker must walk. When you stand in silence before the narcissist, you are not merely withholding words, you are enacting a ritual of death and rebirth. For silence is the tomb in which the old self dies and the womb from which the new self is born. This is why it feels so unbearable at first, why it burns like fire, why it feels like loss. The empaths, so accustomed to defining themselves by what they give, by how they soothe, feels naked without words. But nakedness is initiation. Only when the old garments fall away can the true self stand revealed. The dreams of those in this stage often carry symbols of death. One may dream of funerals, of coffins, of decaying houses. These are not omens of physical death, but images of the psyche shedding what no longer serves. They signify the death of the false self, the self that lived only to be seen by others, that existed only in reflection. Silence accelerates this death. For in silence, the false self receives no fuel, and yet, in these same dreams, they are often symbols of rebirth, a child emerging, a flower opening, a new house being built. These signify the self rising from the ashes of the persona, stronger, truer, whole. The empath who remains in silence passes through the underworld and, like Persephone, returns with new sovereignty. We must also recognize that silence is deeply archetypal in its connection to death itself. Every human being will face the great silence at the end of life. The narcissist, in fleeing silence, flee death. They build fortresses of noise to deny the inevitable. The empath, in learning to embrace silence, prepares for death with dignity. They learn to sit with the unknown, with the absence of sound, with the stillness that mirrors eternity. Thus, their silence is not only a weapon against manipulation, but also a rehearsal for the final initiation. In embracing silence now, they learn to walk calmly into the great silence when it comes not as victims, but as conscious participants in the mystery of existence. Consider also the image of the chrysalis. The caterpillar must weave itself into darkness, into silence, into stillness, before transformation can occur. Within the cocoon, there is no movement, no sound, only dissolution. The old form melts away, becoming formless, indistinguishable, and yet from this dissolution emerges the butterfly, radiant, free, transformed. This is the exact image of the empath's silence. It is a chrysalis. From the outside, it may appear as withdrawal, as nothingness, but within, the soul is reshaping itself, breaking the old patterns, preparing for flight. When the silence ends, when the empath emerges, they do so not as the same being, but as something new, something sovereign, something whole. This is why silence terrifies not only the narcissist, but also the empaths themselves. For silence threatens the very identity that has kept them safe. The identity of the giver, the healer, the one who holds everything together. To let that identity dissolve feels like annihilation. But only by letting it dissolve can the deeper identity of the self emerge. In Jungian terms, this is individuation, the process by which the conscious ego surrenders its false securities and is united with the greater self. Silence is one of the crucibles of this process. It strips away illusions until only truth remains. And what is this truth? That you are not defined by what you give to others, that you are not sustained by another's gaze, that your worth is not measured by the love you can earn. You exist because you are. The self is eternal, rooted not in approval, but in being. When the empath realizes this in silence, a profound shift occurs. They no longer fear abandonment, for they are never truly alone. They no longer fear invisibility, for they see themselves. They no longer fear rejection, for they rest in the embrace of the self, which is beyond rejection. Silence has revealed to them what no word could ever convey, the ground of being itself. The narcissist, faced with this silence, may rage, may withdraw, may seek new mirrors, but the empath no longer dances to that tune. They see the narcissist's hunger for what it is, not a reflection of their own worth, but a wound in the other's soul. They may even feel compassion, for they understand that beneath the mask lies terror, shame, emptiness, But this compassion is no longer entangled. It does not compel them to sacrifice themselves. It is the compassion of the awakened, the compassion that knows boundaries, the compassion that flows from fullness rather than emptiness. Silence has given them this gift, the ability to love without losing themselves. In myth, the hero often must pass through a moment of wordless trial. Orpheus descends into Hades with only his music. Christ is silent before his accusers. The Buddha sits beneath the tree, unmoving, unspeaking, until enlightenment dawns. These moments are archetypal expressions of silence as initiation. The empath, in their confrontation with the narcissist, participates in the same archetype. Their silence is their trial, their initiation into wholeness, and when they emerge, they are no longer merely the empath. They are the individuated soul, carrying both light and shadow, both strength and sensitivity, both silence and speech. The greatest danger for the empath is to break the silence too soon. To return to words before the silence has done its work is to abort the transformation. Words can be a flight from fear, a way of avoiding the abyss. But if one remains in silence long enough, the abyss reveals itself not as emptiness but as fullness. The silence ripens, and then speech returns, not the old speech of justification and appeasement, but a new speech arising from the self. This speech carries authority, not the authority of domination, but of authenticity. When the empath finally speaks after silence, their words are few but powerful. They no longer entangle themselves in argument. They speak truth simply, clearly, without fear, and in that moment, the narcissist cannot manipulate, for truth stands on its own. Thus, the cycle of silence and speech becomes the empath's new rhythm. Silence to withdraw from illusion, speech to affirm truth. Silence to listen to the self, speech to express its voice. This rhythm is not reactive but creative. It is not dictated by the narcissist's demands, but by the inner guidance of the self. The empath who lives by this rhythm is no longer prey but sovereign. They carry silence within them as a weapon, as a shield, as a sanctuary, and wherever they go, they emanate an aura of presence that cannot be manipulated. In the end, silence teaches the empath the most profound lesson of all, that the battle was never against the narcissist, but against their own forgetting of the self. The narcissist was only the mirror, the catalyst, the shadow figure who forced the confrontation. The true enemy was the pattern of abandonment, the wound of invisibility, the fear of rejection, and silence revealed this enemy, stripped it bare, and opened the way to healing. The empath, through silence, has not defeated the narcissist. They have transcended the drama entirely. They are free, so I tell you, embrace silence. Do not fear it. Enter it as one enters a sacred temple. Let it strip you of illusions. Let it bring you face to face with your own wounded child. Let it awaken the hermit, the warrior, the shadow, and the self. Endure its loneliness until it becomes solitude. Let it kill what must die and give birth to what must live, for in silence you will find not absence, but presence, not emptiness, but fullness, not death, but rebirth. And when you emerge, you will carry a strength no narcissist can touch, a light no shadow can devour. Silence is not the end. It is the beginning. It is the weapon that wounds. No one yet liberates the soul. It is the voice of eternity, speaking without words. It is the mystery through which the empath becomes whole, and in that wholeness you will know a truth deeper than any argument, stronger than any illusion, that you have always been, that nothing and no one can diminish the radiance of the self.